man with integrity, but he brings us the history of Ipswich.
But he's a man with a sense of humour.
And this one, I didn't think he was more than about 45 years of age, but this one, 100 years ago, Ipswich had its own international intrigue.
Oh.
So let's cross down live to Canmore, where he's suffering from hypothermia. Harold Peacock. G'day, Harold.
Yes, good morning, Danny. Yeah, it's the international kidnapping intrigue of Ipswich.
Oh, that's right.
That was the centre of the universe back then. Yeah.
Is that a fact, mate? I want you to explain this story. It's brilliant. Take it away.
Yeah. Yeah, look, Samuel Glide Davies, that was his name. He was born in Jersey in the Channel Islands in the 1870s. Mm-hmm. At the turn of the century, he lived on Harlem Street here in Ipswich and worked at Bayard's department store, which you might know was next to the Commonwealth Bank in Brisbane Street, Ipswich.
You knew it well.
Yeah, and look, that building was demolished in 1986, unfortunately, but the story lives on. You see, Samuel's father-in-law was Henry Lowe, who was the first settler in Gatton and was one of the founders of the Congregational Church there. His brother-in-law, Walter Lowe, lived in Ipswich, working in the railway stores department. He left town to be a solicitor in Sydney, but died from a severe attack of typhoid fever. And his only son, Lawrence Lowe, was killed in the First World War. So, Danny, I suppose the lesson here is don't leave Ipswich.
Well, what about his sister? What about his sister, Waterloo?
No, well, his sister Kathleen Davies, so not Waterloo, we'll carry on here. His sister Kathleen, she was married to a Melbourne produce merchant by the Reverend Thomas Malyon, who was one of the best-known Baptist ministers in Australia. Anyway, that produce merchant was subsequently convicted of selling adulterated horse feed. In other words, he was bulking up his oats by adding husks. Now, one of Samuel's brothers was Major Sidney Stephen Davies.
Right.
He received his officer's commission in the artillery in 1911. He served overseas in the First World War and on Thursday Island. At one stage, he was in command of Fort Kissing Point in Townsville and also Fort Lytton here in Brisbane.
Yeah.
But another of Samuel's brothers is where it gets really interesting. You see, the Reverend Charles Freeman Davies in 1904 joined the China Inland Mission. And that's where he met a fellow missionary who had gone out from England a year earlier, and she was destined to become his wife. They met and remained as missionaries in China. Now, in about 1923, when the Reverend was returning home to Australia on leave, a party of Chinese bandits stopped him on the road, forced him to kneel, and one held a huge knife over his bowed neck while the others robbed him and his party. Now, this was during a period of extreme unrest in China, because you know your Chinese history, because this was when warlords were fighting to control the country, and that eventually descended into civil war. And so it got even more interesting for Reverend Davies. You see, in 1926, the army of the warlord General Wu Pei-fu attacked, and bandits looted Chow Kia Cow in Honan province, where Reverend Davies and his wife were working. Now, his mission and the girls' school that was part of the mission, Reverend Davies, was awakened at daybreak by rifle shots. Now, Mrs. Davies and a Miss Poppins, who was another foreign missionary from Melbourne, they had just enough time to be hidden in an outhouse as Reverend Davies got arrested. All the mission buildings were set on fire. The outhouse in which the women had hidden was built of brick, and so was more or less fireproof. The ladies re-emerged 3 days later, safe and sound. Their lives, Danny, their lives have been saved by a toilet. Now, however, the bandits returned, and this time Reverend and Mrs. Davies and Miss Poppins were marched out with the rest of the household at rifle point. But the women could hardly stand, and on Reverend Davies' plea, they were released. But Reverend Davies, he was marched off and held for ransom of £5,000 and 100 revolvers. Now, that was millions of dollars back in the day. Now, the bandits took off with thousands of captives, and Reverend Davies was one of the high-profile foreigners, and many of them were subsequently tortured and killed. And the bandits left behind about 2,000 dead. It was anarchy there. Now, after days of anguish, Ipswich's Samuel Davies received a telegram stating that his brother, who of course was captured by Chinese bandits and held a ransom, had been released. Now, the brother, the Reverend, he then hightailed it back to Queensland and conducted successful ministry at the Rosalie Baptist Church in Brisbane and then the Chatswood Baptist Church in Sydney. And so this ended Ipswich's worldwide notoriety as the centre of an international kidnapping intrigue. This was a global story, Danny, and a lot of the updates were coming from communiques right here to Ipswich.
And you're talking about Henry Low, those Chinese relations there, Wu Pei Fu and Cao Kapow, which is now one of the noises used on the poker machines, Cao Kapow. And the other one was Hung Low. So that's a little bit of history there for you about the Lows. You there?
And the Davies, yes, we'll talk about the Reverend Davies and the Ipswich family. That was the history of that international kidnapping intrigue that people have forgotten about. It was 100 years ago. Ipswich, that's where all the news was coming from, was right here.
Listen, the Ipswich City Council, you want to get it on your platform, you're going to talk about roads, rates and rubbish, and the Ipswich booklet on the history by Harold Peacock. Come on now, get it on your platform now before March. What do you think, Damien?
I agree.
Yeah, exactly. Good on you, Harold. So how do we get this story and other stories?
Yes, you can go online to historyoutthere.com. I'll be posting this with photos and so on about the international kidnapping intrigue, but historyoutthere.com.
It's 8:26. That's Harold Peacock. Thank you for what you do, and Happy New Year. We'll talk to you this time next week.